Today our reading is taken from the book of Luke. When we read from the book of Luke, we see things from a slightly different perspective from the other Gospels. Each of the narratives in Luke invites us to reflect. So now, in this time, in our homes, with the business of the world changing and the pace of our lives creating new rhythms and a new sense of normal, we will all stop together and reflect. Slow your breathing, slow your mind. Release your worries and focus on only my voice. You may like to close your eyes and focus on the words. Focus on what they are saying. Focus on what they mean to you. Listen for the questions that I will pose for you to consider as the reading progresses, and take time to consider your responses. Let us begin. Let us reflect upon the words in the reading today.
Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened.
Did you notice that the 2 disciples are travelling away from Jerusalem? Perhaps trying to distance themselves from the pain of losing Jesus. A common symptom of grief is the discontinuity of ordinary experience, when normal routines lack meaning and purpose. It's during this time of grief that we need to lean more heavily into the faith of the church.
While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him.
How does Jesus come alongside you? Reflect for a moment. Isolation, fear, and grief can blind us to the presence of Jesus. This is why we need to hear the gospel proclaimed to us, to affirm the peace of Christ that comes to us even, or perhaps especially, when we don't expect it. Recall the care and support of others in times of loss and grief.
And Jesus said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" Jesus asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word, before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place."
We hear the pain and grief in the words of these disciples. As they speak of their dashed hopes and failed expectations, what are your hopes in Jesus? What have you expected him to do for you? Note the deeply pastoral way in which Jesus engages with the two disciples, seeking to share their conversation and hear their story. When Jesus eventually responds to them, he does so contextually addressing their particular feelings and concerns.
Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him.
We hear the confusion of the disciples in response to the testimony of the women. Who for you is the most unlikely source of truth about Jesus? Perhaps a child, a person with a disability, a person from a different culture? How will you prepare yourself to hear their testimony?
Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?"
Why are we slow to believe the things that are necessary for Christian discipleship? The cross is the primary symbol of Christian faith. Jesus said, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." The emphasis on the word daily indicates the discipline required for the journey of faith.
Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on, but then they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over."
How do we urge Jesus to stay with us? The Christian tradition does not assume the presence of God. Christian worship commences with a call to worship, or a prayer of invocation, in which God is invited to be present, reflects the context of many of the Psalms, some of which plead with God to appear.
So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?"
How are your eyes opened to Jesus? One of the significant stories of John's Gospel involves a man born blind whose sight is restored so he can worship Jesus. This suggests that worship is critical for our faith, as the scriptures are open to us and we are open to the Word of God speaking us into life.
That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, And they found the 11 and their companions gathered together, and they were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 men told what had happened on the road, and how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
Now, in this time, as we isolate alone and we cannot gather to break bread together, I ask you to take the time to reflect, how is Jesus made known to us? Where do we see the work of Jesus? Where do we see the love of God? And who is with us in our isolation? You are not alone. Hold fast to the love of God, which will never leave you. Let Jesus draw alongside you as you share in the worship of our congregation, proclaiming his risen life, serving each other in faith, hope and love, and praying for the world.